A stretch of empty sand dunes, a flimsy wooden glider bolted to an engine, and 12 seconds that supposedly rewrote human history. Or did it? Because in at least 4 different countries there's a museum, a monument, or a postage stamp insisting someone else flew first. A German immigrant tinkering in a Connecticut yard. A dapper little Brazilian balloonist adored in Paris. A lonely sheep farmer on the far side of the world who never once claimed he'd won. Each one has defenders who insist history got it wrong. So today we're doing something most textbooks skip entirely. We're checking the actual evidence claim by claim. Not the legend, not the slogan on a license plate, the paper trail. By the end, you'll see exactly why one claim holds up under real scrutiny and why the others don't, no matter how loudly they're argued. And you'll see something stranger too, how a museum contract, signed decades after the fact, quietly locked in the official answer for good. This is Clue Series, and this is the real fight over who invented the airplane and who the world decided to believe. The Age of Dreamers. Humans wanted to fly long before anyone came close to actually doing it. The old Greek story about wings made of feathers and wax always ended the same grim way. The wax melted. By 1783, 2 French brothers actually got a human being off the ground, inside a giant paper balloon. Balloons could rise just fine. What they couldn't do was go where you wanted. That problem sat unsolved for 100 years. The real prize was never just leaving the ground. It was staying up, steering on purpose, and landing in one piece. In the early 1800s, a British engineer worked out the physics nobody had bothered to write down. Lift, drag, thrust, weight. He got the theory exactly right. He just never built a powered machine that could carry a person into the air. Decades later, a German engineer picked up that same idea and actually threw himself off a hill with it. Otto Lilienthal built glider after glider, launching himself again and again off that same hill near Berlin. By the mid-1890s, he'd logged more than 2,000 flights. He'd also figured out something crucial. Control matters more than lift. Then, in the summer of 1896, a sudden gust flipped his glider. He fell 50 feet. He died the next day. His last recorded words, reportedly, "Sacrifices must be made." News of his death traveled fast, all the way to a small bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. Meanwhile, an American railroad engineer named Octave Chanute had become the sport's biggest cheerleader. Chanute wasn't chasing the record himself. He was chasing the information, collecting every glider experiment on Earth into a single book. That book would land on the reading list of 2 brothers who ran a print shop and a bicycle business, and were obsessed with balance. So here's the actual puzzle everyone was racing to solve, stated plainly. Build a machine heavier than air, with its own engine that a person can steer and keep aloft on purpose, not by accident. Whoever solved all 3 parts first got to call themselves first. Whoever solved only 1 or 2 got a century of argument instead. Dozens of inventors across 3 continents believed they were close. One pair of brothers was about to prove they weren't just close. They were there. 2 brothers from Dayton. Wilbur and Orville Wright didn't have engineering degrees. What they had was a bicycle shop and a habit of testing everything themselves. Neither brother had finished college. Wilbur nearly did, until an accident changed his plans. It didn't matter. They read everything they could find. In 1899, Wilbur wrote a polite, curious letter to the Smithsonian Institution asking for everything they had on flying machines. What set them apart wasn't ambition. Plenty of inventors had that. It was a hunch that control mattered more than raw power. Most rivals were obsessed with horsepower. Give a machine a big enough engine, they figured, and it would simply muscle its way into the sky. The Wrights thought that was backwards. A bicycle doesn't move on power alone. A rider balances it constantly. Why should a flying machine be any different? Wilbur later said the idea clicked while he was absent-mindedly twisting a long cardboard box between his fingers at the counter. Twist the two ends of a wing in opposite directions, he realized, and you could tip the whole aircraft left or right on command. That idea, wing warping, became the seed of real in-flight control. Almost nobody else was building toward that problem at all. To test it, they needed steady wind, soft sand to crash into, and nobody watching. One place fit every requirement: Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. In 1900, they arrived at a remote, mosquito-plagued stretch of dunes with their first glider and started out flying it like an oversized kite. The following year, they came back with a bigger glider. Frustratingly, it flew worse than the first one had. Wilbur, discouraged, reportedly told his brother it might be 1,000 years before man ever truly flew. The problem wasn't their design. It was the data. The published lift tables every glider builder trusted were simply wrong. So the brothers did something almost nobody else bothered to do. They built their own wind tunnel in the back of the bicycle shop. Inside it, they tested roughly 200 miniature wing shapes, measuring lift and drag with instruments they'd built themselves. By 1902, their corrected numbers let them build a glider that finally behaved the way the math actually predicted. But warping the wings alone caused an odd side effect. The glider would suddenly skid sideways and drop a wing without warning. Their fix was a small movable rudder at the tail, linked to the same wing warping controls, a solution still echoed in aircraft today. With that fix in place, they flew close to 1,000 glides that season. Control, the part almost everyone else had ignored, was basically solved. Power was the last piece. No engine maker sold anything light enough, so the brothers designed one themselves and hired a machinist to build it. They also proved something nobody had worked out mathematically before. A propeller isn't a fan pushing air. It's a rotating wing, making its own lift sideways. That single insight made their propellers far more efficient than anything else being built anywhere at the time. By late 1903, they had a steerable glider, an engine light enough to lift it, and efficient propellers. All that was left was to try it. Kitty Hawk, December 17, 1903. December 17, 1903. The temperature hovered near freezing, and the wind was blowing a steady, brutal 27 miles an hour. 3 days earlier, they'd already tried once. Wilbur won a coin toss for the honor and immediately stalled the machine right off the rail. Minor damage, dented pride, a few days of repairs. Today it was Orville's turn. They'd hung a bedsheet on their camp roof, a signal to the life-saving station 4 miles down the beach that today might be the day. 5 men showed up to watch, a handful of volunteers from the coast station, and 1 local boy. One of them had never operated a camera before. He was handed one anyway, and told to squeeze the bulb at the right moment. At 10:35 that morning, Orville lay flat in the hip cradle that controlled the wing warping, and the engine roared to life. Wilbur ran alongside, steadying the wingtip for exactly as long as his legs could keep up with it. Then it lifted. 12 seconds. 120 feet. Slower than a person can jog, and the most important 120 feet in history. The shutter clicked at exactly the right instant. That single photograph would end up in nearly every history book ever printed. They took turns after that. Wilbur went next, a little further, then Orville again, further still. On the 4th flight of the day, Wilbur stayed airborne for 59 seconds and covered 852 feet. Worth saying plainly, that's shorter than a modern jetliner's wingspan. At the time, it felt like the whole sky had opened up. Minutes later, a sudden gust caught the grounded flyer and tumbled it across the sand, wrecking it for good. Flying was over for the day, and as it turned out, for the rest of the year. That evening, they sent a telegram home to their father in Dayton. 4 flights, Thursday morning. Longest 59 seconds. Inform press. Home for Christmas. Their father passed it along to a local reporter, who somehow got almost every detail wrong in the next day's paper. No photograph ran with that first story. No reporters descended on Dayton. The most important flight in history landed, at first, with barely a ripple. The Wrights, for their part, weren't chasing headlines yet. They were already thinking about patents, and about who might try to steal the idea. Flyers or liars. For almost 5 years after Kitty Hawk, the average person had every reason to think the Wright brothers were exaggerating. Through 1904 and 1905, they kept flying, not exactly in secret, just quietly, in a cow pasture outside Dayton called Huffman Prairie. By October 1905, their improved machine could stay airborne for 39 minutes and cover 24 miles in tight circles. That's genuine, sustained, controlled flight. And almost nobody outside their small circle of neighbors took it seriously at all. One Dayton newspaper editor later admitted he simply hadn't run the story, because in his words, nobody would have believed it anyway. Then the brothers made a choice that would haunt their reputation for years. They stopped flying entirely to protect their patent. No demonstrations, no independent witnesses, just quiet negotiations with the U.S. Army and a French syndicate while rumors piled up outside. The press filled that silence with doubt. In January 1906, one American newspaper based in Paris put it about as bluntly as possible. The Wrights have flown, or they have not flown. They are, in fact, either flyers or liars. Hard to imagine a harsher way to phrase it. Even a respected technical magazine ran skeptical pieces pointing out that if the claims were true, why hadn't a single journalist actually watched it happen? Their old mentor didn't exactly help matters. He'd described their glider designs to French aviation enthusiasts a little too loosely. European builders copied those rough sketches into their own gliders and watched them perform terribly. Some concluded the whole story had to be inflated. The friendship between the mentor and the brothers curdled over the next few years into a bitter, very public dispute over who deserved credit for what. Meanwhile, back home, the Wrights had filed for a patent in 1903. It wasn't granted until 1906, and its exact wording would matter enormously later. It didn't just cover wing warping. It covered steering an aircraft by combining wing control with a rudder, broad enough to reach almost any rival's design. That single broad claim would eventually drag them into a brutal legal war with America's other leading aircraft builder. But that fight was still a few years off. For now, the more urgent problem was simpler. Almost nobody outside Dayton actually believed them. And while the Wrights stayed quiet, other men elsewhere weren't waiting to be convinced. They were building their own machines and making their own headlines. One of them claimed he'd already been flying 2 full years before Kitty Hawk, from a quiet street in Connecticut. His name was Gustave Whitehead. More than a century later, people are still fighting over whether he beat the Wright brothers into the air. The man in Bridgeport. Gustave Whitehead was born in Germany, immigrated to the U.S., and spent his career doing something unglamorous, building engines and gliders for other people for hire. By 1901, he was living in Bridgeport, Connecticut, tinkering with a strange bat-like monoplane he called Number 21. On August 14, 1901, according to a story published 4 days later, that machine flew roughly half a mile over a field near Fairfield before dawn. The only account came from a local Sunday paper, written in the breathless, dramatized-style newspapers of that era used for almost everything, real or not. The article even included invented dialogue between Whitehead and his assistants, mid-flight. That's not how serious reporting works, then or now. No photograph shows that flight actually happening. The picture in the paper was drawn by an illustrator, not captured on film. Whitehead wrote to a few technical magazines describing his machines himself. Editors at the time mostly shrugged and moved on. Here's the strangest part of his story. Within 2 years, he'd abandoned this advanced design and gone back to a far more primitive glider. If you'd already cracked powered flight, why would you go backwards? That question has never been fully answered. Whitehead kept almost no records of his own. No logbooks, no diaries. Nothing resembling the mountain of paperwork the Wright brothers left behind. He drifted into obscurity, worked odd engineering jobs for other aviation companies, and died in 1927, largely unknown outside Bridgeport. He was buried in an unmarked grave. It took almost 40 years and a small group of admirers before anyone put up a headstone at all. So how did this story come roaring back more than a century later, all the way to a state legislature? In the 1930s, a researcher tracked down elderly Bridgeport residents and collected their memories of the alleged flight. The problem, those interviews happened 30-plus years after the fact. Compare that to Kitty Hawk, where witnesses were interviewed within the same year. Memory researchers will tell you plainly, decades-old eyewitness recollections are, at best, shaky evidence for exact dates, altitudes, and distances. Then, in 2013, a respected aviation reference book published an editorial declaring Whitehead the true first in flight, based partly on a supposedly enhanced old photograph. That photo shows a blurry shape on a wall inside a crowded 1906 exhibition hall, allegedly his machine, mid-flight, in the background of an unrelated picture. Critics pointed out the obvious problem. The actual original photograph has been missing since 1906. Everyone was arguing over a copy of a copy. Connecticut's legislature didn't wait for the argument to settle. Weeks later, they passed a law officially naming Whitehead the state's first in-flight pioneer. North Carolina and Ohio, states that had built tourism campaigns around the Wright brothers, were, understandably, furious. One lawmaker called the new law an attempt to rewrite history. Another was blunter, calling the whole claim a fairy tale. The Smithsonian's own historians pushed back hard, standing by their original conclusion. Whitehead's case simply doesn't hold up next to the Wright's evidence. Even a respected aeronautical society, no strangers to controversy themselves, reviewed the case independently and came back with a blunt verdict: not proven. A separate engineering analysis raised its own doubt. By most calculations, Whitehead's engine likely wasn't powerful enough to sustain the flight his supporters describe. So where does that leave things? Whitehead was a real talented engine builder. But talented isn't first to fly, and only one claim has real evidence: the Aviator of Paris. Alberto Santos-Dumont grew up on a Brazilian coffee plantation, moved to Paris as a young man, and quickly became one of France's most famous men. Before he ever touched an airplane, he was already a celebrity for flying small, steerable balloons called dirigibles right over the rooftops of Paris. In 1901, he looped his airship around the Eiffel Tower and back to win a major prize. Crowds in the street cheered him on by name. He was rich, stylish, and adored, the kind of celebrity aviation had never really had before. After mastering balloons, he set his sights on something harder: a heavier-than-air machine that could fly without any gas bag at all. His new design looked almost nothing like the Wrights' machine, a strange, boxy biplane some onlookers compared to a giant kite. On October 23, 1906, in front of an official crowd at a field outside Paris, that machine flew 60 meters under its own power. Officials from the French Aero Club were right there with stopwatches and measuring tape. No ambiguity, no missing photograph, no decades later witness statement. 3 weeks later, on November 12th, he did it again, 220 meters, in just under 22 seconds. Also fully certified. For a while, that flight held an actual title, the first powered flight officially certified by an international sporting body anywhere on Earth. Here's the honest catch, though. Both flights ended the same way. The machine started rolling uncontrollably, and Santos-Dumont cut the engine to bring it down safely. His design had no way to correct that roll in the air. What the Wrights had already solved with wing warping, this machine simply couldn't do. So which detail matters more, that his flight was certified in public, or that the Wrights' machine actually had working control? That's really the whole argument in miniature, and it's why two very different countries can put this era's achievement on their money and monuments. In Brazil, Santos-Dumont isn't a footnote. He's the father of aviation, full stop, taught in schools, honored with a national holiday. The Brazilian argument isn't baseless. It leans on a real technical distinction. The Wrights used a launch rail and needed a headwind to get airborne. Santos-Dumont's machine, by contrast, took off entirely under its own power, on wheels from flat ground, no rail, no external assistance. To some, that makes his flight the first genuinely unassisted takeoff, even if it came 3 years later and covered a fraction of the distance. In 2016, Brazil put Santos-Dumont front and center at the Rio Olympics opening ceremony. American viewers online were, let's say, not thrilled. It's a genuinely useful case study in how first can mean different things depending on which specific rule you're measuring against. Santos-Dumont's later years were harder. He grew increasingly troubled watching the machine he loved get turned into a weapon of war. His health declined through the 1920s, and he died in Brazil in 1932, deeply unhappy with how his invention had been used. He never seriously disputed the Wrights' claim to being first into the air. He simply believed quite reasonably that his own flight deserved its own recognition. And it did. Just not the same recognition, which is really the theme running through this entire story. Other contenders across the globe. The Wrights and Santos-Dumont weren't the only names in this race. At least half a dozen other inventors, on 3 continents, chased the same prize. None of them get the same recognition. Once you look closely at what they actually achieved, it's usually easy to see why. In France, a brilliant, eccentric engineer had been chasing powered flight since before the Wright brothers were even born. In 1890, his steam-powered, bat-winged machine lifted a few inches off the ground and skimmed forward roughly 160 feet. Arguably the first powered takeoff of a heavier-than-air machine under its own power in recorded history. Also, by any definition, not a controlled flight. 7 years later, testing an improved version for the French Army, he claimed a far longer flight. Official military observers told a very different story. Their report, published years afterward, concluded the machine ran off course and crashed. It never achieved real controlled flight at all. He did leave one undisputed legacy, though. He coined the very word the French still use for airplane today. In Germany, an engineer was testing his own motorized glider on a field outside Hanover in the very same month as Kitty Hawk. In August 1903, he managed a short hop about 60 feet, a few feet off the ground. By November, he'd stretched that to nearly 200 feet, straight ahead, low, and completely uncontrolled. He never claimed to have achieved true, controlled flight himself. Some regional enthusiasts have made that claim on his behalf more than a century later. Most aviation historians agree an uncontrolled straight hop, however real, isn't the same achievement as what happened at Kitty Hawk 2 months earlier. On the other side of the planet, a reclusive sheep farmer in New Zealand was building something even stranger, alone, with almost no outside help. He built his own aircraft from bamboo, tubular steel, wire, and canvas, including a tricycle undercarriage and an adjustable propeller, ideas years ahead of their time. Sometime around 1903, he wheeled it down a farm road, became airborne for perhaps 50 yards, then crashed straight into his own hedge. Here's the twist nobody expects. Pearse himself always said no. He never claimed he'd beaten the Wright brothers, or that it was proper, controlled flight. Compare that to some of the other claims in this story, and Pearse comes across almost refreshingly honest. Even the exact date of his hop is disputed. His own letters, written years later, gave conflicting years for when it actually happened. What is settled? He patented several genuinely clever ideas in 1906, years before most of the world caught up to them. New Zealand honors him today for exactly that: brilliant, self-taught engineering. Not for a flight record nobody, including Pearse, ever seriously claimed he held. Russia has its own candidate, a naval officer who launched a steam-powered monoplane off a wooden ramp back in 1884. It left the ramp briefly and came straight back down. Most historians outside Russia treat it as a dramatic, gravity-assisted slide, not sustained flight. In England, an eccentric inventor built a steam-powered rig so powerful it briefly tore free of its restraining rails. He never called that a real flight. In Romania, an inventor briefly hopped nearly 40 feet off the ground under his own power, on wheels months before Santos-Dumont's famous flight. In Denmark, another inventor managed a longer hop that same year, but his machine stayed tethered to a pole the whole time. Add them all up and you get a strange picture. Puzzle pieces scattered across half the globe, almost nobody holding every piece at once. Except, as we've already seen, one pair of brothers in Ohio who'd solved it years earlier and just hadn't convinced anyone yet, proving it to the world. By the spring of 1908, the Wrights had run out of room to stay quiet. Government contracts on both sides of the Atlantic finally demanded proof. They dusted off their machine, retrained at Kitty Hawk, and even added a second seat, because now they needed to fly with a passenger on board. Then the brothers split up. Wilbur sailed for France. Orville stayed behind for a nervous U.S. Army trial outside Washington. On August 8, 1908, Wilbur flew in public for the very first time at a racecourse near Le Mans. European crowds had only ever seen wobbly, uncontrolled hops from local imitators. What they watched instead was a machine banking smoothly through tight, precise circles. One French aviator in the crowd reportedly said it best, in just 3 words: "We are beaten." Overnight, the story flipped completely. Newspapers that had mocked the brothers for years now ran breathless front-page praise. Over the following months, Wilbur flew again and again at Le Mans and later near Pau, breaking his own altitude and duration records almost weekly. Royalty and aristocrats showed up just to watch him fly. He trained French pilots himself and became, almost overnight, one of Europe's most famous men. Back in Virginia, Orville's trial for the U.S., Army started just as strong. Then on September 17th, disaster. A propeller blade split mid-flight and the machine crashed hard to the ground. Orville survived with serious injuries. His passenger that day, an Army officer, did not. The first person ever killed in a powered airplane crash. It was a genuine tragedy and a sobering reminder that this new machine came with real, deadly risk. Orville recovered slowly through the winter. The following summer, he came back and finished the Army trial himself. In 1909, the improved flyer met every speed and duration requirement the Army had set. It became the first airplane any military ever purchased. That same year, Wilbur added one more unforgettable image, circling a famous harbor statue in front of 1 million people watching from shore. The city erupted. Ships in the harbor blew their horns. It's hard to overstate how completely the public mood had reversed in barely a year. The French government awarded them medals. The Smithsonian, of all institutions, gave them an honor too. Congress eventually struck them a gold medal of their own. Within a few years, the brothers, once dismissed as liars, were internationally recognized as the men who'd solved powered flight first. It's worth pausing on how that happened. Not through new evidence about 1903 that had been solid all along. It happened through public, repeatable demonstration. In other words, first and credited turned out to be two different achievements, and that gap nearly cost the Wrights their place in history. But the public argument was really only half the battle. The other half was about to play out somewhere much stranger, inside a museum. The Museum War. 9 days before Kitty Hawk, the Smithsonian Institution's own chief scientist tried, and very publicly failed, to beat the Wrights into the air. He had spent $50,000 government dollars, a fortune at the time, building his aerodrome. It crashed straight into the river, twice. Newspapers mocked it mercilessly, calling it everything but a flying machine. Its builder, humiliated, died a few years later. You'd think that would be the end of his role in this story. It wasn't, not even close. Meanwhile, back home, the Wrights were fighting a different war entirely. A bitter patent lawsuit against America's other major aircraft builder. Their 1906 patent was broad enough to cover almost any system combining wing control with a rudder, including a newer approach using hinged wingtips. The rival manufacturer had built his machines using exactly that newer approach. The Wrights sued and mostly won. The lawsuit dragged on for years, tying up American aircraft manufacturing in legal fees right as European builders raced ahead with new designs. Then in 1914, the Smithsonian made a move that still generates arguments today. They quietly hired the Wrights' own patent war rival to rebuild the long-crashed aerodrome with a new engine, floats, and dozens of structural changes. That heavily modified machine finally flew briefly over a lake in New York. The Smithsonian then quietly restored it back to its 1903 appearance for display, and they put a label on it, claiming this earlier design had been capable of flight before the Wrights ever left the ground. They didn't mention, at least not clearly, just how many parts of the machine had been quietly changed to make that brief flight possible. Orville Wright was furious. To him, this looked less like research and more like an institution protecting its own scientist's legacy, using his own rival. So he did something almost unthinkable for a national treasure. He shipped the actual 1903 flyer overseas on permanent loan to a museum in London. For 2 decades, the machine that first proved powered flight possible sat on display in Britain, not America. It took until 1942 for the Smithsonian to finally, formally admit how extensively that 1914 test aircraft had been altered and retract its earlier claim. Even then, it took the inventor's death in 1948 to actually bring the flyer home, through a contract his estate signed with the Smithsonian. That contract still governs the museum today, and it contains one very unusual clause. The Smithsonian must always display the flyer as the first machine capable of powered, controlled, sustained flight or risk losing the aircraft entirely. That doesn't make the Smithsonian's judgment about Whitehead wrong, independent reviewers agreed. But the institution does have a real built-in stake in the answer, which raises a fair question worth sitting with. How much of official history is about evidence, and how much is about who signed which contract? Why the world still argues. So, let's finally answer the question in the title, as plainly and fairly as the evidence allows. On the narrow, specific claim, first sustained, controlled, powered flight of a heavier-than-air machine, the evidence points to one place. Kitty Hawk, December 17, 1903. That's not blind national loyalty talking. It's the paper trail, detailed notebooks, contemporaneous letters, a same-day photograph, and witnesses interviewed within the year. Every other claim we've covered is missing at least one of those pieces, sometimes all of them at once. But first to achieve it and first to get credit for it are not the same story. Hopefully this episode made that gap obvious. Santos-Dumont's flight really was the first one certified live, in public, by an international body, and his unassisted takeoff really was a genuine technical advance. Brazil isn't wrong to be proud of that. It's measuring a slightly different, equally real achievement. Whitehead's case is the shakiest of the bunch. Thin documentation, a flight told only through a dramatized newspaper story, and decades-late witness memories. That doesn't make him a fraud. It makes his claim, by the normal standards historians use for any other event, simply unproven. Connecticut's law didn't actually settle that question. Laws can honor local pride. They can't retroactively manufacture missing evidence. Ader gave the world a word. Jatho gave Germany a folk hero. Pearse gave New Zealand a brilliant, humble inventor who never claimed the title. None of them answer who invented the airplane. They're part of a richer, messier story than one date can hold. And the Smithsonian's own contract is a genuine wrinkle worth remembering, proof that even official history gets shaped by very human pressures, pride, embarrassment, legal deals. So here's the honest, balanced verdict in one breath. The Wright brothers hold the strongest, best documented claim to the first sustained, controlled, powered flight. That part is about as settled as history gets. Everything else, who deserves how much credit, who counts as first by which rule, whose pride gets a monument, is still genuinely up for debate. Remember that museum contract clause from earlier? It's a small human reminder that history isn't just recorded. Sometimes it's negotiated, which brings us back to where we started. A dusty field, a rail, and 12 seconds that almost nobody believed for the next 5 years. The men who did it barely got credit for the first half of that decade. Then, almost overnight, the whole world caught up. That's the real lesson here. Being right and being believed are two completely different battles, and the second one is often harder to win. If you've made it this far, you now know more about this argument than most licensed pilots do. So, which claim do you find most convincing? Whitehead's newspaper story? Santos-Dumont's certified flight? Or the quiet, well-documented mechanics from Dayton? Drop your answer in the comments. This is one of those arguments historians still genuinely enjoy having. If you liked digging through the real evidence instead of the textbook version, that's exactly what this channel does, every single episode. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. This has been Clue Series.